The views and opinions expressed on this program are those of the guests appearing on the program and do not necessarily reflect the views and opinions of 8 News Now or Nexstar Media Group.
We know that there are things that we need to improve on, and that's what we've spent a lot of the interim doing.
There's some things that need to be thought through a little further.
Criminal justice reforms on the forefront. What's in store up in Carson City as we head toward the last month of the legislative session?
Rip the blinders off for the whole world to see the systemic racism.
A renewed push for police reform. After the guilty verdict for Derek Chauvin, we look at the new push for a bill in Congress. And the report is in. We break down the answers from Nevada's Secretary of State to Republican claims of voter fraud. Thank you for joining us here on Politics Now. I'm John Langler. At the legislative session, another key deadline in Carson City passed this week. Bills that were not declared exempt had to pass the House they originated in. Some were exempt because of funding. In all, more than 130 bills sailed through the Senate and the Assembly on Tuesday. So let's start in the Assembly with a bill that would seal some eviction records during the pandemic. Democrats passed Assembly Bill 141. It would seal eviction for non-payment and extend how long those evictions would take to be processed. Democrats say the measure will help people who lose their homes be able to rent again. Several landlords, though, testify this simply creates more demand and higher rents. A bill to allow the Attorney General's office to do pattern and practice investigations of police departments passed the Assembly unanimously. AB 58 lets the AG decide if something is the action of a rogue cop or a wider systemic issue within a department. A bill that would allow college athletes to make money off of their image passed the Assembly. They could use their likeness, name, or image in sponsorships with a few limits. Similar bills have been passed in other states as well. A bill to rework Nevada's unemployment system passed the state Senate. SB 75 gives people more flexibility on benefit eligibility. It also provides some relief on their unemployment tax rate, but it does not address a major overhaul of DETR's software or other technological issues which have come to the forefront during the pandemic. A bill that tackles hairstyle discrimination also moved forward. Senate Bill 327 allows people to have knots, locks, or braids at work or public schools. Republican Senator Ira Hansen was the only no vote. A bail reform bill made it through the Senate. SB 369 requires a court to only impose bail or conditions of release if they are, quote, the least restrictive means necessary. Right now, the standard is for the court, rather, is to show good cause. All right, so with the session a little more than halfway complete, what is next in Carson City? Well, we wanted to speak with leadership from both sides. Democrat Senate Majority Leader Nicole Cannizzaro works in the Clark County DA's office in her day job. I spoke with her about criminal justice reforms and whether the session may go into overtime.
Whether it's police reform or bail reform, a lot of talk of reform in Carson City right now. Specifically, Senate Bill 369 made it through the Senate. What is your expectation of it actually getting to the governor's desk?
You know, we've been working throughout the interim on issues related to police reform and to bail reform. Last session, we put together an interim study that was chaired by Senator Dallas Harris to address and look at the issues around bail reform and the cash bail system to ensure that when people are, arrested for an offense, that they're treated fairly. We know that there are things that we need to improve on, and that's what we've spent a lot of the interim doing. And I think you're seeing the fruits of that labor come forward in the form of Senate Bill 369, as you mentioned, and a few others that we've been working on. Senate Bill 369 is, of course, still going to give courts the latitude to impose bail or to impose restrictions like house arrest or stay-away orders to ensure that the safety of victims can be at the forefront for individuals who are maybe involved in a dangerous and violent crime. And I think that this is not only aligning with reforming that system of cash bail so that it is a fair system, but also ensuring that we can keep the community safe. In my day job, I've been a prosecutor for close to 10 years now. And so this is something that I have some familiarity with, but definitely know how important it is that we assure the safety of the community, while at the same time making sure that the system that we come into contact with, that we rely on, is fair and is just.
When it comes to police reform, there have been some measures that, the sheriff Sheriff Lombardo here seems willing to see some of the reforms that have been put in place. He would suggest with Clark County elsewhere across Nevada. In your experience up in Carson City now, is there a willingness by other lawmakers to have the same kind of reform put in place?
I think so. We're seeing that in a number of Senate bills. I mentioned Senator Dallas Harris has been working on a number of those issues. We've passed a couple of those that require for police units and law enforcement agencies to have in their policies and procedures de-escalation techniques, that those are things that have to be taken into consideration when we're looking at use of force policies. We also have seen some legislation come over that is bipartisan in nature from the Assembly that deals with the use of force by police officers. Speaker Frierson has a bill that deals with post-training.
What is left to do? What are some big things that are still on the horizon? There was discussion in the beginning about trying to bring more revenue into Nevada, issues with regards to mining taxes, internet sales, etc. Are those still potentially on the table here? There's obviously deadlines on that were coming pretty quick.
Yeah, I mean, we still do have quite a bit of work to do in the legislature. We've just had a deadline where the bills sort of switch houses. So in order to get any of these policy proposals over the final finish line, we still have to go through either the Assembly or the Senate, depending on which house the bill is in at this point. So we still have quite a bit of work to do to accomplish our policy objectives. And with respect to some of the revenue conversations, we know that the state of Nevada is still in need of revenue for things like education. Those are important things that every, I think, parent recognizes, teacher recognizes, child recognizes, every legislator recognizes. We have got to do more to ensure that our students are getting a quality education.
Potential for a special session if things don't get done on time, and if that does happen, is that should we be disappointed in that as observers of the legislative session, or was that expected to begin with?
You know, I always say that 120 days flies by faster than you think it will. And so for 120 days, you know, we are committed to the business of the state of Nevada. I have every anticipation that we are going to end that business on time in 120 days. But we do have some outstanding issues with respect to federal funds that we're still awaiting guidance on. And so there may come a time where we have to continue that conversation.
So Ms. Canizaro, as she mentioned, is a Clark County prosecutor. Republican Co-Deputy Minority Floor Leader Tom Roberts is a former Metro Police Assistant Chief. He opposed abolishing the death penalty, but has signed on to some of the criminal justice reforms discussed in Carson City. He spoke with our David Charnes, and they started discussing bail reform.
I think we got to be careful that, like right now we're experiencing in Las Vegas, is you have visitors from California that are coming here. They're being caught with guns and things on the strip, and they're being let out immediately, based on a relaxation of bail and or, releasing people with no bail, and they're not showing up for court. And so that gets word out to folks that are traveling here that do those kind of things that, you're going to get in trouble. You're not going to face any consequences. And so I think that could be a byproduct of too much relaxation of bail. There needs to be some kind of risk assessment to people. We need to follow that. Don't need to be too lenient. We need to keep the public safe, but at the same time, respect people's rights.
I don't know where the governor sits on the assisted suicide, but he was pretty quick to say that he didn't support getting rid of the death penalty. So both of these issues, like I mentioned, have been brought up before. I assume you don't support either of them, but do they have a chance of actually becoming law?
For the death penalty cases, I mean, there was certainly a good argument for the cost and the fact that, nobody has been executed in this state. But however, I think the DAs, the district attorneys in the state, brought up some good valid arguments that if you start with death penalty cases quite often, and then you get down to a lower, through a plea agreement to, a life without. And so they're really taking any death penalty cases forward. If you lower it to where you're starting at a life without, then quite often you're going below that in any plea deal. And so they felt it took away some leverage in plea deals. or dealing some of these cases out. And I felt I needed to support him in that effort. Assisted suicide, or the Death with Dignity bill, I have not heard that bill yet, but I need to hear both sides.
The big things that police groups don't want to see is this ban on no-knock warrants and that kind of stuff. So what do you think should be implemented, and what do you think shouldn't?
So, I believe in involving community members in the decision-making process. And I've said this before, is like at Metro, you have the Multicultural Advisory Council, right? And so you have citizens that are involved in policy making for the department, and you're crime fighting. They're community members. They participate in the process, and the outcomes that you get from that are great, which is why I had a bill to add one person to the Post Commission, which is Police Officers Standards and Training Commission, that establishes all the training for police officers for the state. I wanted to add one civilian. Actually, the Speaker had a bill to add two. I killed my bill. I signed on to him. I think some of the use of force, and there's bills out there that wouldn't allow police officers to arrest on misdemeanors. You could only issue citations. There are challenges with that. There's some things in statute that require you to make arrests, like domestic violence or DUI, or you have a trespass. For instance, if somebody's trespassing on your property and you call me as a police officer and I show up, I write them a ticket and they still refuse to leave, what am I supposed to do, right? All right, write them another ticket, so there's some things that need to be thought through a little further.
Both of those interviews are available now on 8newsnow.com. So there are two big dates on the horizon at the legislative session. May 4th, the next economic forum tells the state how much money they have to work with. May 14th is the committee passage deadline in the second house. The last day of the legislative session is May 31st. Shooting down election fraud claims. Next on Politics Now, Republicans made thousands of complaints about the last election. Nevada's Secretary of State issues its report on what really happened.
You're watching Politics Now.
This week, former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin was found guilty in the death of George Floyd. Soon afterwards, the Department of Justice announced an investigation into Minneapolis police. Attorney General Merrick Garland says it'll look into whether the department engages in unlawful policing and discrimination. The investigation by the feds is expected to take at least a year. The case is historic, the Derek Chauvin case. Police officers are rarely charged, fewer even convicted for killing someone while on duty. In Congress, that led to renewed talk about a potential police reform bill. Vice President Kamala Harris says police reforms still need to happen. She urged the Senate to pass the police reform measure named after George Floyd. Republicans are against it. Alabama Senator Tommy Tuberville said this about what comes next.
I want to make sure that we back our police, because there's a lot of good ones,
A measure of justice isn't the same as equal justice. This verdict brings us a step closer, and the fact is, we still have work to do.
From Washington to discuss the latest conversations in Washington, Alex, where do things stand right now?
Hey there. Well, Democrats are really pushing for passage of their package, the George Floyd Justice in Policing Act. And it is really a sweeping bill that makes quite a few changes, including, on a national level, banning police chokeholds, for example, and no-knock warrants. But it also would end qualified immunity for police officers. So it would make it easier to sue police officers for wrongdoing or abuse of power. And that issue right there is perhaps the biggest sticking point and the biggest issue that Republican lawmakers have with the police reform bill that Democrats are proposing. They say Republicans say they are completely against ending qualified immunity for police officers. Some of them told us that, police officers' jobs are already hard enough already as it is, and that they see this as essentially taking away any support for those officers.
Is there an ability to find compromise on Capitol Hill, despite the fact there's this difference of how police reform should look? Can Republicans and Democrats come to some sort of a middle ground?
Well, it definitely seems like they're trying, but I will say we saw this play out last year after George Floyd was killed. Democrats were again pushing for this same police reform bill. They again did pass it in the U.S. House last year as well. But Republicans, had their own version of a police reform package that was completely different, and both sides, didn't really budge, even though the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act passed in the U.S. House. The Senate never took it up in a committee, never tried to amend it, didn't debate it. It didn't go anywhere. And so this time around, Democratic Congresswoman Karen Bass is taking the lead, and she says she is in conversations with Republican Senator Tim Scott to try to forge some compromise. And she says these negotiations are happening in good faith, but whether that's going to result in some kind of compromise that gets 60 votes in the U.S. Senate and then also gets enough support from the more progressive members of the U.S. House and gets enough support to pass in the House as well, that still remains to be seen.
Certainly a major issue in Washington, Minnesota, and here in Las Vegas as well. Alex Limon, thank you for joining us. Nevada's Secretary of State says there was no proof of widespread election fraud from November of 2020. However, the office is investigating nearly 24 cases stemming from last year's election. The office put out a report last week on the complaints that the Nevada Republican Party delivered last month, claiming it had more than 100,000 examples of fraud. Well, out of nearly 4,000 dead people they claim actually voted, a review from the Office of Vital Statistics found only 10 deceased voters in Nevada had ballots cast in their names. The review also found 10 other people may have voted twice. The Secretary of State's office says none of the GOP's other accusations were valid. Several judges, including the state Supreme Court, threw out lawsuits to try and overturn the election results. Next on Politics Now, getting in the race.
I just think we can do it better.
Up next, I ask Sheriff Joe Lombardo about why he may run for governor.
You're watching Politics Now.
Is also a topic in Carson City, as we discussed earlier in the program. This week on Good Day Las Vegas, I interviewed Sheriff Joe Lombardo about those bills and also his potential run for governor. There are bills being considered, measures to increase accountability, increase oversight on police departments nationwide. Do you support some of the measures being considered, for example, up in Carson City at the legislative session to add more guidelines and to add more restrictions, I shouldn't say restrictions, but more rules essentially for engagement in the field?
Yes, absolutely support them. And fortunately, a lot of what they're talking about, excuse me, are already in place here at Metro. They're ponying or they're copying off our policies that we have in place to make it standard practice across the entire state. So, unfortunately, smaller police departments sometimes are slow to move, or they need help from a larger police department because of resources availability, and they use the policies and procedures and the language associated with how we conduct business from a big department onto their department. And I'm actually pretty proud of what I'm seeing up there, because they're taking what we've seen and what we've adjusted for and what we're putting into place across the state. And then in turn, you're seeing similar actions across the United States with all police departments.
Let's switch gears a little bit, Sheriff. You recently went public with the Las Vegas Review-Journal about your potential plans to change jobs and potentially run for governor. Where do things stand right now for the possible run for another office in 2022?
Well, I appreciate the question, but I'm still in the same situation as I described to the Review-Journal. My primary focus right now is being your Clark County Sheriff. That's what I was voted in for to do. But you look at new challenges in life and you figure out what you're going to do into the future, and maybe you can affect some larger changes in another position. And I will make a decision on that here in the very short future. More than likely in the next few weeks, on what I'm planning on doing for the state of Nevada.
What is it about the current administration that maybe would motivate you to consider running for governor?
I just think we can do it better, and that would be the line I would use.
Can you be more specific about doing it better?
No, I'm worried about my job as the sheriff right now.
All right, just a brief response there from Sheriff Lombardo. Meanwhile, a potential Republican field for governor slowly taking shape. North Las Vegas Mayor John Lee recently switched to the Republican Party, and this week he announced a 17-county, all the counties, Nevada campaign swing starting in Esmeralda County. Now, Lee has not officially announced he's running for governor yet, but this might be a first salvo into that. Well, this week we're bringing back our Following the Money segment, and first quarter fundraising totals are in. We're focusing on a couple of Nevada's key races for 2022. As you see behind me there, Democratic Senator Catherine Cortez Masto raised $2.3 million in the first quarter. She has about $4.7 million in cash on hand. As for Democratic Congresswoman Susie Lee, she raised about $607,000 for her District 3 race. As you can see, she has $484,000 of cash on hand. And Congressman Stephen Horsford raised $363,000. He is in, of course, Congressional District 4, and he has $757,000 in cash on hand. No major Republican challengers have taken shape yet.
You're watching Politics Now.
Finally, here on Politics Now, Florida Governor Ron DeSantis is going to be at the Basque Fry fundraiser held by Adam Laxalt every year here in Nevada. The Republican event is going to be August 14th in Gardnerville. No other speakers have been announced yet, but in the past it's been aligned with CPAC. Former Vice President Mike Pence, among others, have spoken there before. We'll see you next week here on Politics Now. Thanks for watching.